In Ecuador, President Guillermo Lasso announced the use of force and will decrease by 10 cents the gallon of gasoline and diesel in the framework of the national strike. Hundreds of protesters marched in Germany, where leaders of the G7 is meeting demanding action on climate change. Human rights organizations, as well as different governments and leaders of the Maghreb, have asserted that the Moroccan government plans to bury migrants killed at the Melilla ends in mass graves without identifying or determining the causes of death. Hello, welcome to From the South. I'm Luis Alberto Matos from the teleSUR studios in Havana, Cuba. We begin with the news. We update information about Ecuador's situation this Sunday, a few hours before reaching 15 consecutive days of protest. President Guillermo Lasso announced that he will increase the use of force and will decrease by 10 cents the gallon of gasoline and diesel. On the verge of midnight, and while the legislature discusses his impeachment, the head of state assured that the decisions taken by his government help the demonstrators to return to their territories. However, the mobilizations in the capital and at national level continue. The Ecuadorian president also referred to the leaders of the strike, whom he disqualified, adding that he would not insist in dialoguing with those who do not want to do so. Although President Lasso assured that his government is committed to resolve all the points on the agenda of the native peoples, he also promised that the national police and the armed forces, which have been accused of serious human rights violations in the context of the mobilization, would continue to make progressive use of force.
For those who continue with the violence and causing trouble, our national police and armed forces will continue to act through the progressive use of force to restore order and to return to the citizens the tranquility they require to live in peace and to work and prosper.
During his speech, the Ecuadorian head of state warned those who mobilize against his government's policies that he will bring them to justice.
During the last few days, our country witnessed multiple acts of vandalism and sabotage. None of these crimes will go unpunished, and all those who have committed them will be brought to justice.
At the end of his speech, President Lasso announced a reduction in fuel prices.
I have decided to reduce the price of extra and Ecopi gasoline by 10 cents per gallon, and diesel also by 10 cents per gallon.
The President of the National Assembly of Ecuador, Virgilio Saquicela, suspended for a few hours the parliamentary session that is discussing a request for the impeachment of President Guillermo Lasso. At the time of suspension, Saquicela pointed out that there were still more than 40 requests from deputies to give their opinion on the request to impeach the Ecuadorian head of state. The Union for Hope coalition presented the request, accusing President Lasso for not trying to solve the political crisis that has shaken the country since the beginning of the mobilizations called by the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador. Once the debate on the impeachment request finishes, legislators will have 72 hours to vote whether or not to proceed with the measure against Guillermo Lasso. For its approval, the petition requires at least 92 votes in favor of the more than 137 legislators in Congress. The leaders of the indigenous movement of Ecuador also addressed the country and human rights organizations to request the creation of humanitarian and supply logistical corridors throughout the country. After ratifying that the national strike and protest mobilizations against the government of Guillermo Lasso will continue, they appealed to solidarity to ask for the speeding up of these corridors that can guarantee the passage of medical supplies and ambulances, as well as other essential items. Leonidas Issa, president of the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, also called on the Red Cross to be guarantors of the functionality of the humanitarian routes they are creating.
This struggle continues for our dignity and for the results, but also in this way, as fellow countrymen, we ask in the most solidary way that the humanitarian logistic corridors be guaranteed, as well as the Red Cross as a humanitarian organization to facilitate a logistic corridor to guarantee the passage of ambulances, gas for domestic use, everything that means an emergency.
In Brazil, according to the latest polls, former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva leads the voting intention for the presidential elections of October. According to a new survey by the Research Institute for Results Communication, Lula has 43% voting intention, while his main opponent, President Jair Bolsonaro, obtained 33% of support among those interviewed. The study also revealed that Lula would be tied considering the margin of error of 2 percentage points with the sum of all the other pre-candidates, which would guarantee him in the first round. Authorities in Mexico report that at least 6 police officers were killed and 4 others were wounded on Sunday after being attacked by a group of armed men in the northern state of Nuevo León. Nuevo León Defense Secretary Samuel Garcia said that the confrontation occurred in the early hours of Sunday morning when local police officers responded to an attack by unknown men in armored vans. The assailants outnumbered the police. Police sources say it is still unknown whether those involved in the attack belong to any criminal gang. Mexican Obrador said in his morning briefing before the press this Monday that authorities have identified the group of criminals. He condemned their actions and said the investigation is still underway. Thousands of Haitians marched in support of former President Jean-Bertrand Aristide and demanded he take the reins of the increasingly troubled Caribbean country. Demonstrators held leafy green branches, and some had the Haitian flag and pictures of Aristide as they walked peacefully throughout the capital of Port-au-Prince and denounced the spike in violence, deepened economic crisis, and the worsening struggles that many in the country of more than 11 million people are facing after the killing of President Jovenel Moïse. The march came as Prime Minister Ariel Henry met with civil society leaders and others in an attempt to stabilize the country and hold general elections. We are now taking a short break, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. Hundreds of protesters marched in Germany near where leaders of the G7 is meeting, demanding action on climate change. Demonstrators demanded that the G7 countries fulfill their responsibilities and become more active in tackling climate change and global hunger, among other issues. Protesters say world's problems cannot be solved by the world's 7 largest industrialized economies alone. They can only be truly solved through platforms such as the United Nations under a banner reading global justice, saving climate instead of arming. Several speakers addressed the crowd of protesters, calling for more action to fight climate change.
The leaders of the 7 most powerful Western nations, but the decisions they make are of concern for the whole population of all countries in the world. And the countries that suffer most from the politics of the G7 are not sitting on the same table.
In Germany, the heads of state of the G7 members of the G7 group met this Sunday to seek a united bloc in support of Ukraine and the consequences of the conflict in Eastern Europe. The meeting between the leaders will be held until June 28th at the Elmau Castle in the Bavarian region, where they will discuss the economic devastation caused by the war in Ukraine, the food crisis, as well as climate change. In the framework of the meeting, Joe Biden, President of the United States, announced new sanctions against Russia. Countries such as Germany, Canada, the United States, France, Italy, and Japan, the United Kingdom, which make up the group, are seeking to strengthen the bloc's maneuvers to counteract China and Russia. The government of France requested that Venezuela and Iran be allowed to return to the oil market in order to stop the increase in fuel prices at a global level. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, requested during the G7 Leaders Summit that both nations be able to return to the market, while he asked countries that supply the international oil market to increase their production. Exceptionally, the objective of the French government will be to put a brake on the continuous rise in fuel prices in the last month as a consequence of the restrictions imposed by the West on Russian oil. Venezuela and Iran are central to world oil production, and in recent years they have been affected by economic sanctions imposed by the United States and its allies. Prosecutors in the Paris attacks trial demanded a life sentence without parole for the main suspect in the November 2015 strike that killed more than 100 people in France's worst terror assault. Salah Abdeslam is the only surviving member of the attackers who opened fire in the Bataclan concert hall and on cafe terraces in adjacent streets and detonated suicide bombs at the Stade de France sports arena. Also on trial are 19 others accused of various degrees of assistance to the killers. From providing logistical support to planning the attacks or supplying weapons, prosecutors also requested standard life sentences for suspected Islamic State members and a Belgian accused of having provided weapons and logistical support. The verdict is due on June 29th. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO will massively increase the number of high response forces to more than 300,000 troops. Jens Stoltenberg, the organization's alliance secretary general, announced that NATO will decide to increase their rapid reaction force, which currently numbers about 40,000 troops and provides operational support for the military groups. Operation Stoltenberg previously stressed that NATO's summit in Madrid will adopt a new security concept where Russia will be recognized as a threat and not as a partner of the organization. The Peruvian Ministry of Health confirmed that the country entered this Sunday into the fourth wave of COVID-19 and also reported the first case of monkeypox. According to the Health Ministry, the ceiling set for the number of infections has been exceeded by 5%. Last week, the country confirmed 1,800 patients with the virus, while in the week ending this Sunday, the figure has risen to 11,000. In view of these records, the Ministry of Health has recommended citizens to go to vaccination centers as the only way to prevent the disease. The head of the National Health Institute, Victor Suarez Moreno, explained that unlike the third wave, when the increase in cases occurred very rapidly, in this fourth wave what is worrying is the constant increase in infections.
There is no formal definition of a fourth wave by the WHO or other institutions, but it is something that is observed when there is an increase like this. For example, the third wave was sudden. There was not much to discuss. It was evident that we were on a third wave. Now what we have is an increase of cases that has been slow but constant. What this is suggesting is that we are already at the beginning of a fourth wave, and the reports of the weekend will confirm it. But I believe that we can agree to say that we are in a fourth wave, adding not only to the increase of cases, but to the presence of these variants, as well as our observations of the neighboring countries.
Primary, middle, and high school students in China's capital Beijing started returning for in-person classes on Monday as the COVID-19 pandemic situation eased in the city. However, local authorities state that students in closed-off management areas, restricted control areas, and those self-quarantining at home will continue online classes at home. Following the resumption of schools, the Beijing Municipal Education Commission also issued new requirements for epidemic prevention on campus. The new requirements include checking the health monitoring records of teachers, students, and staff members within 14 days, urging students to dine at evenly spaced times and avoid peak hours while setting up isolation barriers at dining tables, as well as pay attention to self-protection on the way to and from school. And we have more news coming up after a final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back from the South. Human rights organizations as well as different governments and leaders of two Maghreb have asserted that the Moroccan government plans to bury migrants killed at the Melilla fence in mass graves without identifying or determining the causes of death. At the Sidi Salem Cemetery on the outskirts of the Moroccan city of Nador, less than 15 kilometers from the place of the events, workers prepare mass graves. Spanish and Moroccan activists claim that they plan to bury there at least 23 bodies of the African migrants massacred by the Moroccan security forces last Friday. In addition to referring that the real number of deaths could exceed 40, they fear that they will be buried without a judicial investigation. At present, 18 migrants and 1 member of the Moroccan security forces are still in a local hospital. They are essential to the investigation and to the identification of the victims.
Migration authorities make sure that there is no transparency. They hide and manipulate information. In other cases, they fail to investigate. Some of the information belongs to Morocco, and the treaties are on the basis of silence.
The African Union condemned violent and degrading treatment exercised by Moroccan forces against thousands of migrants at the border fence of Melilla and called for an immediate and transparent investigation. The president of the African Union Commission, Moussa Faki Mahamat, expressed his deep shock at the violent treatment of African migrants who tried to cross one of the international borders of Morocco with Spain. The senior official of the regional group recalled that countries must comply with their obligations under international law, which includes, among other principles, that all migrants be treated with dignity, while safety and human rights must be prioritized. Human rights associations on both sides of the border put the total number of deaths at between 27 and 37. A child died and a number of others were injured after a 3-story building collapsed in Tripoli, Lebanon. Residents of the Dar el-Magar area in Tripoli and rescue workers pulled a dead child and a number of injured people from the rubble following the collapse in the northern city. Residents stated that the building collapsed due to the state's negligence to all buildings. Members of the Red Cross, civil defense, and security forces rushed to the scene to help with recovery works.
Due to the state's negligence in such old buildings, a brick fell from the building, and when someone tried to move it, the whole building collapsed.
During his opening statements at the United Nations Ocean Conference in Lisbon, Portugal, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that without drastic action, the world's ocean plastic could outweigh all the fish in the oceans by 2050.
When we see the Earth from space, we truly appreciate that we live on a blue planet. The ocean connects us all. Sadly, we have taken the ocean for granted. And today we face what I would call an ocean emergency. We must turn the tide. Global heating is pushing ocean temperatures to record levels, creating fiercer and more frequent storms. Sea levels are rising. Low-lying island nations face inundation, as do many major coastal cities in the world. The climate crisis is also making the ocean more acidic, which is disrupting the marine food chain.
And teleSUR expands its signal with new satellite parameters, and more than ever, the world connects to us and our stories are heard in other faraway nations. These parameters are in place since June 1st in Latin America and the Caribbean, both in English and in Spanish, and quite soon further changes will be implemented for the signals in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. This news multi-platform will continue providing truthful content to oppose the hegemonic media's narrative and our faithfulness to our audience. We have come to the end of this news brief. Remember, you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also join us on our social media on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For teleSUR English, I'm Luis Alberto Matos. Thank you for watching.